time, the decline of the middle class, how and why it happened, and what we should do about it. I have a bunch of slides. I'll try to summarize some of these, but basically what we're going to talk about today is a fundamental shift that's occurred in our economy in the United States from what has historically been known as stakeholder capitalism. And I'll talk more about that. It's one that benefits all, and one driven by a philosophy as it was replaced by one driven by a philosophy of maximizing shareholder value, which is really what has created the inequality and the hollowing of the middle class. And it has a lot more implications about the future. Compounding that problem of that shift, there was at the same time a new political strategy that began under Newt Gingrich and a little bit before that, where a new partisan political strategy emerged. Historically, the Republicans, and we know there are a number of very good Republicans in New York, for example, as a state FL-CIO, we've endorsed a number of them. You remember guys like Jack Javits and Ken Keating and Amo Houghton and people like that who are part of that tradition. However, under the new group, especially now, they've really aligned themselves with the right wing of the Republican Party, and it's even gone even more now, as we can see with the Trumpism that we're facing. Now, this shift is not always there. We go back and talk about stakeholder capitalism, largely in place from the end of World War II until, say, the mid-70s. This is an example of a CEO of Standard Oil at that point in time and how he viewed things. And for example, the role of management, he says, to maintain an equitable and working balance among the claims of various affected interest groups. Now that included stockholders, of course, but also included employees and customers and the public at large. That began to change when we saw the emergence of the thinkers like Milton Friedman. And he had a very different view. Few trends, he said, could have so thoroughly undermined the very foundations of our free society as the acceptance by these corporate officials of social responsibility. So he's condemning what you just heard. And their goal is to make as much money as possible for stakeholders. And so this was kind of part of the launch pad to a new philosophy. Excuse me. There's a wonderful book. I suggest you all get a chance if you can. It's by Lynn Stout. Lynn Stout died much too young. She was a professor of law at Cornell University, where I've had the pleasure of serving as a trustee for many years, a trustee emeritus now. And she has really unmasked this whole myth about shareholder value, making the point that for most of the 20th century, managers believed corporations should really not only serve their shareholders, as was mentioned by the previous executive, but also employees, customers, and the nation in future generations. One important characteristic historically of these corporations was that they pursued long-term goals, long-term research, and it would sometimes not even produce profits for many years out. An idea, by the way, that the Japanese stole in the late 70s and 80s and began their rise in the world economy. So here's what Lynn Stout says, that shareholders really own the corporations. Executive pay then became tied to shareholder returns. And so you can see what implication that would have. So you buy shares, you pump up price, you sell them for a quick profit. You then boost share prices by any means possible. In other words, according to Lynn Stout, shareholder value became the king. The goal really to maximize shareholder value by an exclusive focus on short-term profits. And then what are the consequences of that? Well, one of the early consequences, and one we're still seeing, especially in the last Trump tax cut, but going from 2000 to 2018, for example, 466 of the top companies spent about $4 trillion on stock buybacks, 53% of their profits. Additional 40% of corporate profits then went to dividends. So maximizing shareholder value, if they have all of these profits, instead of sharing them with workers or making long-term investments, they poured it back into the stocks. And if the stocks went up, of course, shareholder value went up, and as shareholder value went up, the remuneration for top executives went up. So it was a motivation that clearly was counterproductive. Now, interesting enough, there are a couple of Republicans. I'm not a big fan of Marco Rubio, but recently he came out and he kind of identified this. So there are some voices on the Republican side who at least are getting it. Not many. He's maybe one of a handful. But says when corporation uses profits for stock buyback, it's deciding that returning capital to shareholders is better for business than investing in their products and workers. A tax code encourages this. So then Rubio says, no surprise, we have work life that is unstable and low paying as a result of that. By the way, he wasn't very well appreciated by his colleagues for that. One of the major factors that helped turn the corner here on moving from stakeholder value to shareholder value was the so-called Powell Manifesto, who became a member of the Supreme Court, as you may know. And he wrote what's known as this manifesto in the 70s, and it was done for the Chamber of Commerce. And what he says is all of this stuff of shareholder value is nuts. What we need really is a corporate takeover of our dominant public institutions so that we can transform this agenda from stakeholder value to maximizing profits. And that's done by assiduously cultivating our political power. And that now we have to use, all the corporations have to use this power to make sure that that agenda is embedded in our economy and in our culture. So that led to what is known as the revolt of the bosses. And what the corporations did then is they developed a linkage with a number of, or created in many cases, these conservative family corporate foundations. You're familiar with all of these names. They're supported by the Koch brothers, the Coors, Scaife, and so on. But below you see all the names you're quite familiar with, the Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, and so forth. Some of those were expressly created to be the brains, to be the think tank, and provide the cover, I would argue, for this transformation from stakeholder value to stockholder value. The result of all of this shows that, and the result demonstrates the current state of working Americans now is primarily driven by this fundamental shift, maximizing profits and shareholder value, as opposed to maintaining this stakeholder value where stockholders, employees, customers, and large are part of the scheme. One commentator said, shareholders got rewarded beyond the wildest dream, but he said there's a cost, and that's the point I'm going to be talking more about today. What is that cost if you maximize shareholder value? It's stagnant wages, it's downsizing, it's layoffs, and those things widen the inequality that we now have in our country, which essentially meant with the widening inequality, what happened is that very few got richer and many others lost value and share in our economy, and that led to these widening inequalities. So this shift that we see really has a number of consequences that I'm going to try to go through as briefly as I can. Productivity, wages and benefits, health insurance, pensions, minimum wage, income inequality, CEO compensation, and worker power are all the areas where this has been affected. This is probably one of the most significant charts that you can see. This shows you that up until about 1980, the increase in productivity and compensation were about equal. Productivity is output per worker per hour. So as the productivity went up by the workers, their compensation went up equal to that. Now, look at the dates that I'm talking about the mid-70s when Milton Friedman came in and this shareholder value philosophy began to take hold in the major corporations of America, you're beginning to see what happened. There was a continued increase in productivity all the way up till now, 2020. But what you see is the hourly compensation dropped. So the thing to focus on here is this gap between the two lines, the dark blue line and the light blue line. What that means, what that shows is the income inequality that resulted from this. So even though workers were working hard and producing more output per worker per hour, their share of it was diverted here to stocks and profits. And the point I'm going to make a number of times is that this was done, as we can see, at the expense of workers. Now, by the way, nobody, I think, or very few people begrudge people doing better and the wealth, gaining more wealth. The problem is when that wealth and that income of the top 10 and 1% comes at the expense of everybody else, then we got a problem. And that's what these graphs are going to show. That sure, they got wealthier, but up until 1970, they got wealthier, but so did workers. But when they get wealthier and the other people are stagnant, that means that that wealth has come at the expense of workers, and that is what led to the decline of the middle class. So the minimum wages, for example, this one shows the minimum wage growth. If the minimum wage had kept up with productivity, you can see it would be up to $18.85 an hour right now. And that's just if it kept up with productivity. Then you can see the red line is what really happened to it. The regular hour is $7.25. The one in the middle really shows if it kept up with what the average wage increase is. So people complain about the minimum wage being too high, or opposing a $15 minimum wage. You can see that if it just kept pace with productivity, it would be over $18. So here's what happened. They squeezed the minimum wage, the top 1%, and squeezed out the profits from the minimum wage to enhance their wealth. Now, interestingly, we hear a lot of times from the people on the right that the only people who get the minimum wage are teenagers, and they don't need the money. But if you take a look at the reality here, the number of people, how old they are, the fact that they're mostly women, that they are working full time, so that an increase in minimum wage really benefits working families, not just teenagers, and that's a myth that needs to be taken on quite directly. The share of income, another way of looking at this, of the top 1%, we hear a lot about the top 1%. But if you go back again to 1980, now remember when I said that this trend began to change in the mid to late 70s. And of course, in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, as I'm sure you're all old enough to remember as I am, and began to look at what happened there. So the red line shows the increase in the share of wealth. The share of wealth, the part of the pie that has gone up to the top 1%, and that is 54%. But if you look at what happened to the bottom percent, interestingly, if you look at this in the very beginning, in 1980, the share of wealth by the bottom 90% was higher than it was for the top 1%. And that was a stakeholder economy. And what you see here is over the last number of years that the share of wealth of the top 1% has skyrocketed, and the share of wealth by the bottom has declined. That's because of this philosophy of moving from shareholder value, from stock shared value of everybody getting something to stockholder value. This is one of the results of that. This is earnings growth, which says the same thing. You're going to see this pattern in all of these graphs. By the way, there are a number of organizations you can look to if you want to know more. Probably the best one is the Economic Policy Institute that does brilliant work on all of these things. But here you can see the top percent, 1% earnings grew 15 times faster than the bottom 90%. And again, look where this all started when they were about equal, about 1980, a little before 1980. So it's only been in these last number of years that we have seen this. Actually, from the end of World War II to about the mid-70s is when you had this equality, and there are a bunch of reasons for that we'll talk about later, largely the growth at that point of the American labor movement. Now, this is also interesting because what this points out is you go back to early on, actually way back to the 30s and all up through to more recently, CEO compensation was largely their salary and their bonus. But now you see more recently, the salary they get is stocks and stock options. So the reason for that growth is, as you can see, is this maximizing shareholder value. And as a result of maximizing shareholder value, the top CEOs are going to get much greater remuneration. So again, that's coming at the expense of the workers that produce that wealth. So I'll give you an example. 162 billionaires today have the same wealth as the poorest half of the world, 4.6 billion people, which is a pretty stark idea of how this inequality has been going. The three of them, Gates, Bezos, and Buffett, now, by the way, they're not bad people, and they make important contributions, and you take a philosophy, say, of a Warren Buffett, might be very different than some of the others. Still, they own more wealth than the bottom half, 160 million people in the United States. They have wealth equaling 248.5 billion versus 240. That's not right on the bottom there, but they own all that wealth. Another way to look at this, the top 1%, I got half. You want another half, or what are you greedy or something? And that's a pretty clear illustration visually of what happened here over those years. Now, interesting, the millennials are doing far worse financially than the generations before them. Everybody talks now about how people and children coming up now are not going to be able to do as well as their parents are. Well, that's not true for current generation, true for the millennials. As you can see with student loans, rising rents, healthcare costs, clearly a astounding number. The average net worth of a millennial is below $8,000. And the net worth of Americans 18 to 35, actually since 1996, has dropped 34%. There are a bunch of reasons for that, retirement income and so on and so forth that we'll get into. Weekly earnings of a typical working family fell $16.80 or 1.9% during Trump's first 18 months as president. So you're hearing a lot about how things are going. Remember, if the earnings kept up with productivity, all of these wages would have been going up, not falling. That's just another example of causing the income gap. This is the most recent one we have, and I'm sorry we don't have time to talk about more of the existing economy and the problems that it has now. What I'm trying to do is give you a historical perspective of why the gap was created and the middle class decline. It's being exacerbated now, and it would be a whole other lecture to talk about an analysis of what's happening given the economy as we speak today. But this is the latest unemployment chart, and it can show you, of course, where there were the increases largely when we had the 2008 bump and so on and so forth. But where it is over on the right, we're up to 14.7%. Now, among those, to exacerbate the income inequality, as you look at the rates within that 14.7%, if you're a white middle-class college graduate, it's going to be much lower than that. If you're going to be a minority, Hispanic or Black, or someone with far less education, those numbers are much higher than that. but this is the overall unemployment rate. So income and wealth inequality has been exceedingly exacerbated in the last couple of years under the economic philosophy of the current incumbent, the current holder of the White House. Interesting as well, what about tax revenue? As you can see here, the income tax stayed about the same. If you go back again to 1950, you can see that there was relative parity there between the corporate tax and the income tax. And the payroll tax was quite low. So actually, if you look at the corporate income tax, it has declined quite precipitously. But the tax that affects individuals, which is both the individual income tax and the payroll tax, that's Medicare and Social Security, those have gone up. So this is just another factor that has exacerbated the income inequality, that not only are people not making enough money, but excuse me, they're paying higher taxes, and the corporate taxes are lower. And as you can see, again, those taxes are lower at the expense of taxes being paid by individual income tax and the payroll tax. Employer-sponsored health insurance, so that's all really income and wages and things of that nature. So how has this all affected our health insurance? This shows you the blue line is 1979, the red line is 2017. So you can go back to look here, the bottom fifth, the blue line is, 1979, 27. You can look at the changes here of the people who had health insurance. And you look at the bottom fifth who had health insurance in 1979, it's much greater, and only 24% in 2017. And while that's true of all categories, the impact is worse for working people, excuse me, the health insurance. Now, the problem is related to the previous slide, when you had people being laid off and losing their jobs. We have basically an employer-based healthcare system in this country, unlike most of the Northern European countries have, which is government-based. This is all the argument behind Medicare for all and so on and so forth. But if you're laid off, you lose your health insurance. And that has a huge impact on the lives of millions of Americans. This shows you, give me a water here. This shows you the cumulative increase in health premiums and deductibles. So not only were wages flattened out and unequally distributed, but the deductibles, for example, which is the red line that workers had to pay, have gone up, you can see 63%. So even if you have a job and you have employer-paid health insurance, what comes out of that is the deductibles and the costs. As one who negotiated local contracts for a teachers union out in Western New York, and true virtually in every company now, or even the public sector, always at the bargaining table, it's just not wage increases, but to what extent are the employers going to try to keep their healthcare costs down by shifting the burden to the workers. And you do that by increasing premiums and reducing deductibles. And that chart shows exactly how that's going on. This is a little more complicated, but it does show you net worth by percentile. So the historic, you can see in trillions of dollars, and then percentage. Probably the percentage one is better to look at, the one on the right, and it shows you the top 1% in purple and then the next 9%. So those two colors are actually the top 10%. And then it shows you the next 40, but then way down at the bottom, you can see the bottom 50% of net worth by percentile. And it's quite amazing. And again, this just shows more evidence of the increasing income gap and why you have a declining middle class. Now, it's not spread equally around the country, as you can see. Now, if you look at New York, we are among, if not the most unequal in the country. Largely, that's because of the poverty in our urban areas and our rural areas that you will see, and disproportionately, again, that inequality is among minorities and people who have a lower education. So we have a lot of work to do in New York. Now, retirement plans, a lot of discussion on retirement plans. By the way, there's a wonderful article in yesterday's Washington Post I'll refer to in a second. But, you know, there are two kinds of retirement plan. Well, first, there's no retirement plan. Second, there's retirement only on Social Security alone. The basic stool of a retirement plan is Social Security, savings, and a defined benefit or defined contribution plan. Now, the difference, I'm sure most of you know, a defined contribution plan is like a 401k. The worker takes all the risk, and in some of those cases, the employer will if you put in $50 a paycheck, they'll put in some amount, maybe 25, or they'll match it. Those matches by employers, by the way, since this current economic crisis hit, a number of employers are not matching those 401ks anymore. So this defined contribution means that workers are going to have even less, and they're suffering all the risk. And when you see what's happening to an economy and things like the stock market that crash, that is a disappearing wealth by those people. The other plan is a defined benefit plan, and that means you have a plan that is usually paid mostly by employers, or again, some contribution by employer and worker. And what that means is that your benefit is defined, so that you might get, let's say, 2% a year of your final average 3-year salary or something, but you have that benefit for the rest of your life. And possibly your spouse or someone might carry on some of that after you die. So that is a security that we had for years, and the number of those are really diminishing. So you can see what's happening there. So what happened is, if you have a defined benefit plan, you're fairly secure. So you have your defined benefit plan, you've got your Social Security on top of that, and hopefully some savings, and you're going to have a regular, fairly secure retirement. If you only have a defined contribution plan and you don't have much in savings, and people don't, then you're going to see what happens here. I just picked up some numbers in the Washington Post. Let me just go over those. Half of the American families, 56 to 65, had less than $21,000 in retirement savings in 2016. Half the Americans approaching retirement age, less than $21,000 in savings. 40% over 60 and who are no longer working rely totally on Social Security. That average is about 17,000. 31% participate in employer-sponsored plans, and most move to defined contribution from defined benefit. There's been this cut here. And so what's happening is that people are unprepared for retirement, and we're beginning to see that. People are having to work longer, or they're going into poverty, and when they're hit with what's happening in the economy now, you read story after story about individuals and the devastating toll it's taking on families and on human lives. So you can see this quote here that talks about the Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis, to say we may talk about democracy, but as long as we have wealth concentrate in the hands of a few, you can have democracy, or you can have wealth concentrated in the hands of few. You can't have both. It's just not going to. It's just not going to fly. Now, I'm out of the labor movement. I was a teacher for many years in Western New York. I got involved in the teachers union, and then ultimately as number 2 guy, the Secretary Treasurer of the state AFL-CIO. So I've had a personal journey that has watched what's happened to the American labor movement. Now, let me say up front, there will be a chart later, that what's happening nationally is happening to a far less degree in New York State. You'll see a chart later where New York State is the second most highly organized state in the union. Our organization, the New York State AFL-CIO, has about 2.5 million members. It includes probably 500,000 active retirees. So we're pretty highly organized in the state, which means that New York State and most other comparisons would do well. It's a still a very powerful labor movement, as opposed to what you'd see largely in southern and mostly right-to-work states. So basically, the right to organize and bargain collectively was established in 1935 by the Wagner Act. Robert Wagner, a great senator from New York, part of FDR's New Deal, gave workers the right to organize. Once that was established, the rights of workers to organize took off. That was largely just private sector at that point. Public sector workers, teachers, firefighters, and so on really did not get the right to organize and bargain collectively until, in New York, until the Taylor Law in 1967. But that right to organize, and steel workers and auto workers and machinists and others, was the major factor. I wouldn't say a major factor. It was the major factor in raising benefits, not just of the union members, by the way, but of all workers. And it was, I would argue, the growth of the labor movement and the power of the labor movement was the single most important factor in creating the middle class in the United States. It was the major factor in raising wages, and I'll show you later, in benefit of all workers. And we created the largest middle class in the world. And it really was a counterweight to this corporate power that Milton Friedman and these other people began to talk about earlier. Now, that power comes in a couple of ways. One is at the bargaining table, where you have the right to bargain, and you bargain with your employer. The other is the role of the labor movement in legislation. The AFL-CIO has been called the People's Lobby, largely because they are the ones who fought for unemployment insurance, minimum wage, Social Security, Medicare, and so on. Those wouldn't be here without the power of the labor movement during the post-World War II period and up until the period of Lyndon Johnson. So now, if you're an employer and you see this powerful organization minimizing your opportunity to maximize shareholder value, we're going to see what the consequences of that have been. So this is a very interesting chart. This shows you the share of income going to the top 10%. And another chart that shows you the growth of unions. You can see 1935, this spike in union membership. That's right after the Wagner Act. And then it held fairly steady until about 1980, dropping a little bit because there was employer opposition, Taft-Hartley Act, and things came into existence which made it more difficult to organize. But you can see the share of members who are members of people who are members of unions. And that gap, if the red line went up, that blue line that gap would not have been anywhere near as close. So one of the reasons that the income gap has grown and the top 1% and top 10% has been able to share more is because of the declining influence of unions, because of the war that's been waged against them over the years. Now, even now, there are huge benefits, even though the labor movement helps people who are not in unions. What you see is that if you're a union member, your number, the amount, percentage you have in health insurance and retirement and other defined benefits, paid sick leave, other leaves, are much greater than if you're in a non-union situation. So if you want to cut your costs, if you're an employer, you want to be a unionized or non-unionized firm, and if you want to be non-unionized, what are the motivations and what actions would you take? And it's true also for different sectors. So if you look at the overall premium, it's about 15%, but if you look at education and healthcare and transportation, they're they're higher. If you get down to financial insurance, those people are not organized by and large, and so that wouldn't be as great. But one way to close the gap and re-strengthen the middle class, of course, as you can see right here, is to have a stronger labor movement. This is a big advantage, again, for the people who have been mistreated disproportionately, black workers. And you can see here the advantages that they get with high school and their increase there. The impact on non-union workers, a drop in union membership has taken $14 to $52 out of non-union workers' weekly wages. This shows you the difference between men and women in terms of the increase what has happened to them. Now, this is an interesting chart. You'll see the United States is in the middle of the pack here among other countries, or actually we're near the bottom, number 17. This is an important thing to pause and take a second to look at, because the argument among the employers is that unions are against productivity and they cost us a lot of money. It's going to make things more difficult for us. Where actually, if you look at the most unionized countries in the world, largely in Northern Europe, Sweden and Denmark and Germany and so on and so forth, they have very, very high rates of unionization. And they have very, very low rates of inequality because they have the right to bargain. And I'm going to talk about why that is so there and not here in a second. Union density, this shows you the states, union density that I mentioned just previously. The only one that has a higher density than New York is Hawaii. So that shows us about 22%. My own experience with what we had in New York is that we're up about, this shows 2018. I think it's a little higher than that, but this is, I think, stats from the U.S. Department of Labor. So I won't argue with those. But look who are the lowest states: Utah, South Carolina, 2.7%, North Carolina, 2.7%. So the hostility, and you can see the light blue states, the southern states, and they're predominantly right-to-work states as well. So where the labor movement is stronger, the benefits and salaries and everything else of workers is much higher. And this is a graphic of that. So what has happened? Remember now, if you're an employer and you want to maximize shareholder value, what are your obstacles? Your obstacle is any force that stands in the way of that. Who's going to stand in the way of keeping wages down, keeping benefits down, having healthcare costs less? There's only one group that really stands out there, and that's the American labor movement, and that's unions. So what the strategy then became of major corporations was that the way we're going to increase shareholder value is to weaken the unions. And their first group they wanted to go after were largely the private sector unions. Now, there's always been some animosity there, going all the way back to the 20s. And then, again, it started with Ronald Reagan busting the air traffic controllers in 1981. It gave the guidance to employers and corporations now to really carry out their vicious no holds barred. That was the signal that opened the door for all-out assault and war on organized labor. It had been going on before, but it's really escalated since Ronald Reagan and his philosophy came in. Kate Bronfenbenner, a friend of mine, she's a professor at Cornell, has done a lot of work on looking at what this opposition to organizing by employers looks like. On my website, by the way, if you're interested, I have a website with materials on how to put the site up later at the end. The American Labor Studies Center's mission to promote the teaching and learning about the American labor movement and its history. And it's designed largely to provide curriculum materials for teachers on how to do this. And the site is labor-studies.org, which if you want to know more about this, there's just lots and lots of materials there. But largely what I do is work with the New York State United Teachers, the AFT, the NEA, and other to encourage teachers to integrate study of the American labor movement and its history into the classrooms. But Kate Bronfenbenner has a piece on there. And how do they go about it? Well, they have captive audience meetings. You bring all the workers in. You say, we don't need a third party to come between us. We don't need to work them. Dig up everything they can to, disavow unions and say they're going to take away your voice. One-on-one meetings, the supervisor will come up with an individual and take them alone and say, you really don't want to do this. They form anti-union committees. Increasingly, employers threaten to close if you want to do this. Yingling, a good beer. I love good beer, right? As an example of that, a good unionized company in Pennsylvania, they said, unless you give up your union, we're going to go south. So that's the kind of stuff that's happening still today. And of course, illegal firing. Somebody's leading a charge or even supporting an effort to join a union, they fire them. Now that's against the law. It's against the National Labor Relations Act, but the penalties lack so many teeth that it doesn't have any impact at all, especially when you have a National Labor Relations Board that's appointed by the president. You have one now that's just taking away all kinds of rights of workers and making it very difficult, even more difficult for workers to organize a union by the decisions that they're making. That's part of that ongoing battle. So the private sector was about 35% at its high point in the early 1950s, 1 out of 3 workers. This attack has been so successful that today the percentage of workers in the private sector who are organized is about 6 or 7%. And that's largely because of the success of the employers. And by the way, they're right-wing, the Koch brothers and groups like that fund these anti-union campaigns. So what they've done is to, in the public sector now, they focused on the battleground states. Why the battleground states? Because largely the labor movement has supported Democrats because the Democrats have supported the labor movement. Not exclusively. In New York, over the years, we've had a number of Republicans, historically in the state Senate and so on, who have not been out to kill or attack the labor movement and have supported them. And I go back to people like Jack Javits or in the Southern Tier, Emil Houghton, or I could probably go on and name a bunch of others. The Republicans historically in New York have been different, but nationally it's a different story. And so they work with these people like the Koch brothers and the State Policy Network, which is really out to support the right to work laws. You may be familiar with the Janus decision that recently came out. That was a decision by this Supreme Court, funded by the Koch brothers and this group called the State Policy Network. There is a concept called fair share, and that is in a state like New York, under the law and under federal law, if you win a union election, you have exclusive rights. You organize and you have the sole responsibility of representing everybody in that bargaining unit, whether or not they joined your union or not. So if you get a salary increase, everybody gets the same salary increase. Non-union people get the same salary increase, even though they're not a member of the union. So what a number of states did is they adopted a fair share. It says, well, you have to pay a fee, what they call an agency fee, to the union because it costs the union money to do the research, to do the collective bargaining, and so on and so forth. Might not be as much as the dues, but there was this responsibility. You still had a right to not be a formal member of the union for whatever reason you want. The State Policy Network prompted this Janus decision that said it was a violation of the First Amendment, your uh, right to, your rights of freedom of speech, and therefore they struck down that right. So not only does it make it more difficult for unions to raise the money from there, but what the state policy network has done, you may have seen it. Oh, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, there was a fold over the front page of the Times Union that's what the state policy network, funded by the Koch brothers and so on, are launching a major campaign in newspapers and actually knocking on doors of teachers and others to say, here is a coupon where you can quit your union. You want a $500 raise? Quit the union. Really, what their goal is to destroy the power of the unions in the public sector now. Now, why is that? Because if the private sector power decreased so much and they were effective at it, not that there aren't still powerful unions in the private sector, there are, but this was the last hurdle they had to overcome, was effectively to cut the legs out from under the public sector unions, because they were the ones who were supporting candidates for office who would support the rights of workers. So the real motive here, I found a couple of quotes from one was the Wisconsin state leader of the Koch Foundation, a guy by the name of Scott Fitzgerald. And when talking, and this really was talking about the battle for right to work in Wisconsin and Michigan and some of these other industrial states. He said, look, this battle is really about eliminating unions so that the money is not there for the labor movement. For the labor movement to do what? For the labor movement to support candidates who are going to support them, disproportionately Democrats. So this was this was a political motive. It had nothing to do with the false arguments they were making on the economics. The Michigan director of the Americans for Prosperity, that's again a Koch brothers operation. We fight these battles on taxes and regulations, but really what we'd like to see is to take the unions out on at the knees, so they don't have the resources to fight these battles. Fight these battles, fight against candidates who are going to do away or eliminate the minimum wage, take away other benefits. So they're pretty clear if you get inside what their true motivations are. But if you listen to their propaganda, they don't mention any of this stuff. This is just being a little promotional here of the labor movement, but this is just a graphic that shows you the kind of things that the labor movement has. I had a bumper sticker that says the labor movement, the folks who brought you the weekend, as an example. The point here again is that the labor movement the results of the fights of the labor movement certainly improve the working conditions of the members, but they also have a huge impact on the country at large and other workers. And if they have an impact on all of them, that's something that fights against the diminishment of the decline of the decline of the middle class. This, rather briefly, but it's important that we put it in here. I talked earlier about Western Europe. In the United States, you see now the philosophy of the corporations. That is, do everything they can to disembowel the labor movement. They see workers as a cost to be controlled, not an asset to be developed, and therefore we want to destroy them. I've spent probably 3, 4, or 5 trips, various study trips to Northern Europe, to Denmark, to Sweden, to mostly in Germany, and to look at their economic conditions and what their philosophy is over there, especially as it relates to workers. And what you have there is a very different philosophy, not one that we're out to kill workers because we want to maximize profit. They have a concept called social partners. They bring business, labor, and government together so that they can work together for everybody in the entire country. This is stakeholder capitalism. This is what we had from the end of World War II up until the 1970s. We had stakeholder capitalism. You had political leaders who were very supportive, as well as certain economic leaders. George Romney, Romney's father, and others were people who were stakeholder corporate leaders. In Germany, you think, well, you know, it's our economy will improve if we cut the unions. If you look at Germany, 3 times the number of workers we have here, they have a concept of co-determination, which means that workers are required by law to have representation on corporate boards. Talk about that. German industrial workers and wages are about 1/3 higher than the United States, and they run a trade surplus second only to China. This is what happens when you have not only more workers organized, but when you have a philosophy on the part of corporate leaders to say, you're not our enemy, you're our partners in this. And if we work together, we're going to have a more productive economy. And you can see Germany, and I could go through other Northern European countries, they're going to say the same thing. So this social contract then, very important. Business, labor, and political leaders put together their differences to make agreement on the national interest. What's in the national interest, what's not solely in the corporate interest. So essentially, there is a paper, you can probably Google it, from the Center of American Progress that, again, does very good work on this and rewriting the rules of the American economy. And as I think we've tried to point out, inequality is not inevitable. It's a choice that we have made in this country on how we structure our economy. And we're structuring our economy, a lot of us being done politically, but the people who are influenced in the political process are the people who run the major corporations. If you look at campaign finance laws and so on and so forth, that all assist in doing that. So here's a quote. You're a little blocked out by your screen here. But essentially, it's Madison said, the day's going to come when you're not going to be able, it's impossible because we'll have wealth concentrations in the hands of a few. And when that happens, the best elements are, in a sense, we're going to have a revolution of sorts because of that. Okay, where are we here? So that's the end of my formal presentation. I did put up some resources for you. Again, I guess this has been recorded so you can come back, or if people want copies of this, if you can contact me. My information come up. But Lynn Stout, just very short book, by the way, and we really lost a champion when we lost Lynn Stout. But the shareholder value myth, I would recommend to everybody. The Vanishing American Corporation, in terms of the traditional corporation, by Gerald Davis, American Amnesia. Hacker and Pearson have done brilliant work on the decline of the middle class. They also have a more recent one on winner-take-all politics, and this shows this synergy between the corporations and the political leaders. Hedrick Smith, who's a great writer, Who Stole the American Dream? I think we've made that case. And E.J. Dionne of the Post of the New York Times, Why the Right Went Wrong, and there are lots more books that I could tell you about, but these are good starters. So for more information, there's my Gmail account. I'm happy to hear from you. Comments, suggestions, where you think I'm wrong, I'd be glad to look at that. There's the labor studies. Now the other commercial I will make is one of the goals of the Labor Studies Center is to find physical properties where we can help interpret the history of labor. And so some of you are probably familiar with the story of Kate Mullaney, a young Irish immigrant who in the 1864 in Troy, New York, organized the first all-female union, the Troy Collar Laundry Workers Union, took them out on strike and won the strike, 25% increase in pay. And this was known, the collar laundry workers were really the first bona fide all-female union in the country. Kate went on to be the first woman elected as an officer of a national union. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2000, the International Labor Hall of Fame in 2016. Her house We were, by not-for-profit, the American Labor Studies Center was able to purchase it. We were successful in getting it designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1998. Some of you may recall then First Lady Hillary Clinton came and dedicated the house. And then in 2002, it became designated as a result of legislation sponsored by then Senator Clinton and Congressman McNulty, became a National Historic Site. The difference is a National Landmark, you get a nice plaque and a pat on the back. They're a National Historic Site. There are only 91 National Historic Sites in the entire National Park System. And the Kate Mullaney House is the only one of all the National Historic Sites that focuses on women's history, on labor history, and on immigrant history. And you can learn lots about her. We have annual receptions. We try to raise funds. I'm in the process of restoring it to its original 1869 status. And we hope to have a grand opening later in the year. I've been successful in getting a number of grants to do it. But if you're interested in that, please check that out as well. So I think that.
We thank you.
That finishes it, yeah.
We got another quote here from President.
No. What I did, I worked really hard. I know this is long, but following this is probably another 10 or 15 charts and slides.
Okay, so that's the extra material. I have one question here from Jane Lax that says, what else can be done in addition to labor unions to address income equality? I assume to address income equality. Jane, if you need to expand on that, unmute yourself.
In addition to increasing the labor movement? Well, the answer is politics. You have to become more engaged in politics because most of these, first of all, become better informed as to what to understand the situation is and be able to have intelligent discussions with people about why this is going on. But what we're seeing is we're seeing the income inequality being exacerbated as a result of the man who's in the White House and the people who are controlling the Senate. So the only real way we're going to have an impact on this is to change the leadership in the country. One that would, and you look at tax policy, for example, you take the last tax cut that the Trump administration enacted. It went almost exclusively to the wealthy. It didn't go to, it exacerbated the income inequality. What happened with what the corporations did with the money they got from that big $1 trillion tax cut is they went and went on a spree of stock buybacks. They didn't invest it in workers. They didn't invest it in machinery. They didn't invest it in long-term strategies to make themselves more profitable. So we need a fundamental shift in tax policy. We need to make investments in worker training. We need to make sure that our schools and our vocational schools and our community colleges and voc-tech schools and universities are fully funded. We need social programs that are going to make sure that people who are affected by this have a floor so that they would have universal health care. So there would be, some people are talking about a universal income. There are, if you go to the Center for American Progress, the Roosevelt Institute, there are a number of organizations, the Economic Policy Institute, all of these have very extensive programs that talk about how to reverse from a policy and a political perspective, what are the steps that you need to take. Some of it can be done at the state level. So state laws that we have, state economies, state tax policy. So there's a battle that can be waged there, as well, of course, as the federal level. So it's largely political, but there are, and if you check with any of these institutes I mentioned, they have very comprehensive plans to turn around income inequality.
Okay, we have a couple questions from Andy also that came in on the chat window. First is, what What's the reply to union members who don't want Medicare for all because they gave up wages in exchange for their superb health insurance?
Well, it varies by union and by sector. So the labor movement is divided on that. So you have a number of unions and number of members who want Medicare for all. You have other unions that have very, very strong health systems. And I think they have a fear that if you had a Medicare for all, it wouldn't have the same high standards that the plans they have now. So they're a little bit apprehensive about whether or not the coverage would be the same. There is universal agreement on universal health care coverage, that everybody has health care. Whether Medicare for all is the answer, for everybody, I'm not sure. There are other approaches that say that there ought to be, I think this is Biden's position, that you ought to have a Medicare for all option, so that those unions that feel very strongly about their own and those members could keep what they want, but all those people who don't have that same quality could opt into a form of Medicare healthcare for all. But the idea that Bernie Sanders keeps talking about healthcare as a right and that everybody ought to have access to healthcare is something that everybody agrees to.
Okay, and the second question from Andy, which got cut off at the second part, but the first part is, what effect does the growth of I can't even say the word oligopolies, have on the mobility of labor? And I ended there, Andy, if there's something more you want to add, unmute yourself and add that.
Yeah. Well, what you find is that that is a concentration of wealth. And where you have a concentration of wealth, those people who have that wealth want to protect their interest. And the way that they gain their wealth and grow their wealth largely is not with a pick and shovel. It's largely through growth in their portfolios. So their goal is to increase profitability in shares. They want higher, and this goes back to why those people move to a maximizing profits and maximizing shares because it's to their benefit. So the people make money in two ways. They do it either by working or they do it through their investments. And these oligarchs and others, by and large, it's through investment. Now, in some countries, it's through authoritarian governments where they have different ways of pulling the wealth from people to their own pockets. It has nothing to do with corporations. It has to do with how they utilize the tools of a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime to do that.
Okay, we have a couple questions from Fred. First is, why do you think James Madison was able to predict the wealth inequality?
Why was he able to?
Yeah.
Well, I think when you moved from a divine right of kings system, which they had historically in Europe and so on, where a feudalism system where it wasn't by the amount of money they had, but it was by a system where people were wealth by family and so on, and that was a system that we revolted against. I think they saw that the possibility in the United States that if we in any way diminished our democratic form of government and power became concentrated in the hands of a few, that would result in exactly what we have. So I think Madison's understanding of what the principles were behind the American Revolution and what we were trying to prevent and what we're trying to create in terms of an egalitarian and fully democratic free society, that there's always a danger. Now, isn't it interesting now that we are seeing the decline of democracy around the globe? We're seeing threats to democracy here at home. We're seeing the growth of authoritarian regimes in Hungary and in Turkey and Philippines, and we are seeing tendencies toward authoritarian leadership here in the United States. If you look at no one is above the law, and you look at the just the paper today and what's happening with the Department of Justice and what's happening in other areas, you are seeing trending toward authoritarian characteristics of this country, which is very dangerous. And I think Madison and the other founders of this country were very fearful of that. And that's why they built in, at least what they saw, the protections in the Constitution. Now, the Constitution is interpreted, and it's ultimately interpreted by a majority of the Supreme Court. So I am very worried with them. I'm very concerned about the tendency to the decline of democracy and the growth of authoritarian regimes around the world, and also this very troubling tendency, and part of what we're seeing, of creeping authoritarianism here in the United States.
Okay, another question from Fred. Do you think the higher health insurance deductibles are merely due to free enterprise capitalism?
Well, capitalism would be capitalism. Look, I'm still a capitalist. I'm a stakeholder capitalist. All right, I'm not although we could have a long discussion of social democracy and what socialism looks like in Denmark and Sweden versus here. The reason for those deductibles goes back to this philosophy, this shift in philosophy from stakeholder capitalism to maximizing shareholder value. And if you're going to maximize shareholder value, what that means is that that value has to come from somewhere else. And in this case, it largely comes from the workers who are the stakeholders. So you keep wages down, but you also look at other wages. And one is, if you want to keep your costs of the employer for healthcare down, the only way to do that is to increase deductibles and limit coverage, so the employer doesn't have to pay as much in it. The same thing is true of pension systems. So employers are going from defined benefit to defined contribution because they're cheaper, and there is very little risk on their part. Not only are they going to defined contribution, but they're, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times those defined contributions are matched by employers 50 to 100%. And I'm reading in the paper now that a number of employers are pulling back on those matching contributions, so that the amount of money that people will have to retire will not even be what they expected under a fairly healthy defined contribution plan.
Okay, thank you. Have a question from Ralph, who asks, how do you view the political rights labeling equality and labor rights as socialism?
Try that one more time.
How do you view the political rights labeling equality and labor rights as socialism? So they're attaching a label of socialism to labor rights and to equality and labor rights.
Well, it's a question of definition of socialism and how it's used and how it's misused. The definition of socialism is ownership and control of the means and production. Government ownership and control of the means of production. So that's pure socialism. What the right does is they want to falsely imply that socialism also means a political system like communism, like a dictatorship. So if socialism, we're going to bring back Joe Stalin, and we're going to have all the characteristics of a totalitarian communist society. That's the implication they want to make on that. We have socialism in this country. We have the Veterans Administration. We have Social Security. We have Medicare. Those are government-owned and operated systems. So they are socialism in a sense. I have not had any person from the right say they're willing to give up their Social Security, for example, or to give up the veterans system, or for a long period of time, but now under attack is even the United States Post Office. So when people raise those questions, you really have to dig in and find out what you really mean by socialism. A lot of studying being done now, and a recent piece about in the New York Times, I think, or Washington Post, about Denmark, which is there's a term, social democratic, which means you have a democratic form of government, but you have the government playing a larger role, for example, in healthcare, or the kinds of things, for example, in Denmark now, if they go unemployed there, or in Germany, in many cases, the government will make sure they get their full wages. Well, that's a socialistic system. So you have to dig and pull the scales off of the onion to find out where they're really going on that. The calling this socialism is a form of linguistic trickery, because what they want you to think is a definition of socialism: absolute government, total and control of your entire life, just not the management of various sectors of the economy. We're not about to nationalize the railroad system or nationalize the industries around energy and things of that nature. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. But if you really try to figure out, I think the best way to deal with the right and to deal with people on the other side right now is not by making declarative statements and trying to make your point. What I try to do is ask tough and intelligent questions that you know the answer to, that will eventually, if you have your facts right, if you pose the questions in the right way, it's going to expose their ignorance, whether they admit it or not. That's just a strategy to think about.
Oh, a good strategy. I have another question here from Sherry. How do you think the COVID-19 economic decline in unemployment blanket will affect this income disparity? Will it just keep getting worse?
Yes.
Short, that's sweet, to the point.
Yeah, it's going to exacerbate it. Just look at the chart that I showed on unemployment, up to 14.7%. And if you go beyond those numbers, there's just in the Washington Post today, there's a big story. Economic plan falls hardest on minorities and less educated. That's today's or yesterday's Washington Post. So if you look at the impact, the economic impact of COVID-19, and you dig beyond the headlines, you find that those people who are being hurt most are minorities, Hispanics, blacks, people with less education, less than a high school diploma. And if they're going to be impacted more directly, or people on fixed incomes, that means that the impact is going to be greater on them, which result is, of course, it's only going to widen income the disparity and make inequality greater than it is now.
Okay. Paul, that's all the questions I have. So on that happy note, I want to say thank you very much for everything, for putting this together. We do appreciate it.